Hi everyone, I am doing a video in honor of Nonfiction November. I am not one to say that I have read a ton of nonfiction, but when I thought about doing a video on the nonfiction that I have loved, I did start to think about it and I did come up with 11 titles and I wanted to tell you about those. The first on the list is French Kids Eat Everything by Karen Le Billon. And this is a book, I think I've spoken about it a couple times here and there on my channel, but it is kind of a food memoir of sorts about this woman who is a Canadian. Her husband is French. For the first couple of years of their marriage, they lived in Toronto and had their first couple children, and the children were the very typical like buttered noodles and chicken nuggets were the foods they would eat. And then there would just be these massive tantrums. If they had anything but that, they would not branch out with their food. And then she said to her husband, let's move to France. I want to like experience your French culture. And so they moved to France and lived in the same town as his family. And it was such an interesting learning experience for her. And especially in this epidemic of picky eating in North America. So in Canada and America. Children that are picky eaters. And it was really helpful for me to read this before having children. And so there's several rules, but she's very specific. Like these are not to be viewed as hindrances. They're supposed to be like principles, and eating is supposed to be fun. And so what I love about it is it doesn't indulge children too much with the foods that they want, but it's also not too restrictive in that like you have to finish every last bite on your plate. And so we've really taken those with our kids. And so it's made eating in our household, it doesn't have to be a battle. And the things in general are pretty, the one that's very countercultural and we seem odd to a lot of parents around us is we don't do snacks. And it seems crazy, but if that's the norm for your household, it just works. We don't do snacks. And guess what? Kids are really hungry at meals if you don't do snacks. And especially one thing that she pointed out is like, well, yeah, if they don't like what they get at supper, and if you give them a bedtime snack, they're not going to finish their supper because then they can rely on the bedtime snack. But what I also like is that they don't have to finish everything on their plate. Like if you don't want it, that's fine. I'm not going to force you. You know your belly, you know how much you want, but also you don't get a second choice. I'm not a short order cook. And those things have been really helpful to us to make mealtime a joy. Now, saying that, my second, Arthur, is definitely more picky. And my older one, Peter, if he didn't like what was on the table, but then he realized like we weren't giving something else, he'd be like, well, fine, guess I'm eating this. Whereas Arthur is very stubborn. He's like, nope, I don't want this. I will not eat it. Like, put it out of my sight. But he's that stubborn that he knows he's not going to get another option. He's just willing to not eat something, but he's a very healthy size, so I'm not concerned about him. The next one on the list is The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks. This is a memoir of a shepherd from the Lake District, and it's really special. It's a whole history of the area. It is the story of his family, the story of his life, his experience being a shepherd, working with the sheep, and it follows the course of a year. So you go through 4 seasons and what being a shepherd is like in those 4 seasons. It's written so incredibly beautifully. So incredibly beautiful. I've been meaning to reread it ever since I read it, and I highly recommend it. It's just such an approachable book. I really, really loved this book. It's one of my favorite books ever. Love it. Then As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales from the Making of the Princess Bride. So this is a memoir written by Cary Elwes about his experience filming on The Princess Bride. I love the movie of The Princess Bride. It's so corny and campy, but I love it. It's just a really fun film. And what I love about this is that Cary Elwes has had, a whole career after this. Saw him most recently on Stranger Things season 3. That was odd because he had an American accent. Anyhow, and I love his love for this film and just the gratitude that he shows. This really gave him a career, and he's just not like too highfalutin for it. He just loved the film. He loved filming it, and it's really interesting to hear some of the anecdotes. Next on the list is Home, a Memoir of My Early Years by Julie Andrews Edwards. So as I tell you about this, now I know there's a second memoir that she has written. She wanted to write kind of the early adulthood years. You do hear about her childhood and then her young adulthood up until she's had her oldest daughter, Emma. And it was a really interesting book to kind of get more of a picture of her life. She really did not have the happiest of households that she grew up in. And I just love kind of the dignity and the grace that she's shown in her life later on, despite that, having that really hard childhood. So I already went ahead and put on hold, maybe it's Home Life is the name of the sequel, put a picture up there, and I'm like number 22 in line. So eventually it will come to me. And next on the list is My Life in France by Julia Child. This is a really, really marvelous, humorous, winsome, harrowing tale of Julia Child falling in love, getting married, and living in France, and writing Mastering the Art of French Cooking, volumes 1 and 2. This is a marvelous, these are marvelous cookbooks that make French cooking to Americans seem maybe more doable. And also, I mean, not just for Americans, they're sold all over the world, but just the experience that she talks about. And it's really fun to kind of hear the ins and outs of the publishing world and just how hard she had to work to write this. One anecdote that has always stayed with me, has stuck with me, is when she talks about she was figuring out a method that people at home could make crusty, crispy French bread. You know, the noise in Ratatouille, she's like, good bread makes a noise, and then she squeezes the bread and you hear it like cracking and crunching, and oh, I just love it. And she said, I found out that if you wet an asbestos tile and put it in the oven, it just made the best bread. And she found this out right before they were going to publish it, that, oh, asbestos actually is a hazard. And so they were able to figure out a different source, maybe a clay tile, I don't know. But I thought that was really crazy timing that she almost put out, you know, asbestos French bread. And next on the list is This Victorian Life, Modern Adventures in 19th Century Culture, Cooking, Fashion, and Technology by Sarah A. Chrisman. This is a woman who is a true Victorian Anglophile. She loves and adores everything about the Victorian era. She claims that corsets cured her migraines. There's a whole other book about that. And I mean, I guess if she had migraines all the time, she started wearing corsets and she stopped getting migraines, whatever works. I am not tempted to go that route myself. But it's a really interesting and neat memoir just to kind of see how they put together this house. They live in the Pacific Northwest and they bought a Victorian mansion and have tried to keep it as authentic as possible. There's so many funny anecdotes about her biking on a Victorian bicycle, taking biking trips, and making her own feather bed, and just how many feathers you need to stuff a feather mattress. It's a really fun book, very light, and yeah, just a very sweet, charming memoir. Then a couple nonfiction Novembers ago, I read The Romanov Sisters by Helen Rappaport. I am really, truly, truly fascinated by the Romanov family. And this was a neat memoir in that I can get really intimidated by nonfiction, but I didn't feel intimidated on it because it wasn't just the Romanovs. It was the Romanov sisters. So it kind of focused on the relationships of the sisters and was written in a really lively fashion. I loved getting to know more about them, the relationships that they had. But of course, if you know anything about the Romanovs, the end of it was just so painful. And a thing that I didn't know prior to reading it was that the Romanovs were living in exile when they were all murdered. In my mind, I was picturing, what I was picturing was the Anastasia cartoon. I thought they were in the castle and people just charged in, but they were, what was it? I can't remember, but I mean, it was like a very nice building they were staying in, but they were in exile already, and people came and shot them on the spot. I really thought that it was, I was very shocked and sobered by that. Like, they had stepped down and you still did this. So it's a really heartbreaking book at the end. Very worth your time though. And next on the list is A Chance to Die, The Life and Legacy of Amy Carmichael. This is written by Elisabeth Elliott, who is a marvelous, marvelous writer. She was the wife of Jim Elliott, who is a missionary who was martyred, and she has had such an interesting life. She was just so prolific. And so this is a biography of the missionary Amy Carmichael and her time serving in India, rescuing children out of child prostitution. And she rescued so many children, and they lived in a house together, and it's just about her figuring out how to care for all of these children, how to have a facility, where the money is going to come from. And she was just an amazing lady who filled her 24 hours as much as she possibly could with service to others. And so amazing just how much she gave, and did experience a fair amount of poor health in her life, but she was still able to do really amazing things, even under those conditions. And then another Elisabeth Elliott that I read and loved is called Let Me Be a Woman. And it's a series of essays that she wrote around the time when her daughter was going to be married, and kind of just her observations on womanhood, on being a wife, on being a mother. It's a really gentle, sweet collection that just shows so much care and love for her daughter in it. And though you can get so many good observations for it, it's pretty universal. And then last on the list is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I read this book at a very significant time in my life when I was having a lot of doubts about my faith. And this is Lewis's story of sorts of kind of all of the thoughts he had. He was a very outspoken atheist. And then around his time of conversion, all of the sort of intellectual leaps he had to make, and how he came about that. And it's just a really marvelous collection. C.S. Lewis is very well known, so I don't have to really talk him up, but I definitely recommend it. It's written so well. It's basically apologetics, and apologetics done so very well. Those are the recommendations that I have, the nonfiction that I have loved. Let me know if you've picked up any of them, and I hope you're enjoying whatever nonfiction you're reading, and I will be back for another video soon.